Back on October 28, 1994, a 2D fighting game was released for the Sega Genesis and Super Nintendo Entertainment System. This wasn't out of the ordinary, as fighting games were super popular at the time due to Street Fighter and Mortal Kombat. This game was special, however, due to the fact that it featured the basketball player Shaquille O'Neal, arguably one of the most popular players of the time. On this episode of Universe Retro, we're going to jump right into the story of what many call one of the worst games of all time, Shaq-Fu. Initially pitched as a basketball game starring Shaquille O'Neal, Shaq-Fu became a fighting game due to talks with Shaq himself. Shaq is a self-proclaimed super fan of fighting games, and was really into Mortal Kombat at the time Shaq-Fu started. When Shaq spoke with developer Delphine Software International, he insisted that his game be a fighting game. Delphine acknowledged that they could not compete directly with Street Fighter II and Mortal Kombat from a technical perspective. Instead, they would build a game that highlighted the team's strengths at computer animations. Delphine used the same rotoscoping techniques they used for their 1992 title, Flashback: The Quest for Identity, where actors would be filmed against a blue screen, the frames would be digitized, and artists would touch up the results using over 7,000 original character sketches as a base for defining characters. Shaq portrays himself in the game, though many sequences were directed by a kung fu expert. Other characters were filmed by movie stuntmen and stuntwomen, and Shaq also assisted with some of the dialogue. Roughly 40 people worked on the project in total. In the game's storyline, Shaquille O'Neal walks into a dojo while heading to a charity basketball game in Tokyo, Japan. After speaking with Ryotsu, a martial arts master, Shaq goes to another dimension, the second world, where he must rescue a young boy named Nezu from the evil mummy Set-Ra. The game is a 2D fighting game similar to other fighting games at the time, featuring multiple characters to select from, a story mode, and a versus mode. The game was released initially for the Sega Genesis and Super Nintendo, and afterwards released on the Game Gear, Game Boy, and Amiga console. Shaq-Fu was published by Electronic Arts for the Genesis, Super Nintendo, and Game Gear releases. Black Pearl Software was for the Game Boy release, and Ocean Software published the Amiga release. The Genesis version of Shaq-Fu has 5 more playable characters and 3 more stages than the Super Nintendo version. Thus, the Genesis has a longer story mode. The Amiga version contains the same content as the Genesis version, though the backgrounds have no animation. The Game Boy version has the same 7 characters as the Super Nintendo version, whereas the Game Gear version only has 6 characters. Both the Game Boy and Game Gear versions lack a tournament mode and in-game voices. To capitalize on the blood and violence popularity in Mortal Kombat, both the Genesis and Super Nintendo versions of the game contained a hidden button sequence that would initiate a blood code. The blood code also gave access to finishing moves that were triggered by striking the opponent in a certain way to end the match. When the game initially launched, Shaq simultaneously released his second studio rap album to promote the game launch. Those who pre-ordered or purchased the console versions of the game in its initial launch also got a promotional CD featuring the track Stand and Deliver. Shaq-Fu received mixed reviews at the time of its release. GamePro gave the Super Nintendo version a positive review, praising the ultra-sharp controls and impressive digitized graphics. They reviewed the Genesis version and called it superior to the Super Nintendo version due to its additional characters and improved controls. Electronic Gaming Monthly scored it as a 6 out of 10, and it received a grade D from Entertainment Weekly. The Game Boy version was universally panned, with things like dumbed-down gameplay and a loss of graphical detail being mentioned. Retrospective criticism of the game has been generally negative. Game trailers rated it number 4 worst in their top 10 best and worst video games, and Nintendo Power included it as 3rd worst on its 10 worst games of all time. Despite this retrospective criticism, IGN stated it was undeserved as a result of collective exaggerations. In 1995, there were plans for Delphine Software to develop a sequel for the series, titled Shaq-Fu 2, intended to be released for the Sega Genesis and Super Nintendo sometime during the 4th quarter of 1995 or early 1996. The project was ultimately canceled due to the mixed reception of the first entry, though in the years to follow, original concept art for 5 new characters, along with 7 returning characters and early stage designs that would have been part of the game have surfaced online through the portfolio of one of the developers. In 2018, a sequel to Shaq-Fu was finally developed by Saber Interactive. Shaq-Fu: A Legend Reborn is a beat-em-up released for Windows, Nintendo Switch, PlayStation 4, and Xbox One. A Legend Reborn features gameplay that heavily differs from its predecessor, more akin to a beat-em-up style game than in the original fighter. The player character has a variety of moves, such as rolling and dashing, which stuns enemies. Players can also chain attacks together and use a special attack. Shaq-Fu: A Legend Reborn was financed via a successful Indiegogo crowdfunding campaign that started in 2014. The funding goal was $450,000, and when the campaign ended 1 month later, the funding goal was exceeded and hit $473,884. On June 29, 2018, a DLC add-on titled Barack Fu: The Adventures of Dirty Barry was released in 2 launch trailers. It was made available for free to those who had purchased a physical copy of A Legend Reborn. Barack Fu continues the story of A Legend Reborn, following the ending of Shaq's campaign, with the player now taking control of a fictionalized version of former President Barack Obama, through 2 new stages as he goes through France and outer space to defeat a fictionalized take on rapper Kanye West. With the exception of the Xbox One version, Shaq-Fu: A Legend Reborn received generally negative reviews from the critics. Unfortunately, Shaq-Fu has been described universally as one of the worst video games of all time. Upon initial release, it was pretty much described as mediocre, but over time it has grown more negative. There's even a website whose sole mission is to get every copy of Shaq-Fu and save humanity from encountering this game. I believe all the hate is a little extreme. In my opinion, Shaq-Fu is a mediocre game, but you could definitely find much worse fighting games, and I'm looking at you, Pit Fighter. If you haven't checked out Shaq-Fu, I actually recommend you do, especially when it can be found for so cheap. Thanks for watching this episode and retrospect on Shaq-Fu. And don't forget, in this universe, we keep it retro.